Your bread started dying 3 days ago. That bag of sliced white bread sitting on your kitchen counter right now has already begun to rot from the inside. You just can't see it yet. But in 1923, archaeologists crawling through a collapsed farmhouse in rural Sweden found something that should not have existed. Hanging from the ceiling rafters on a birch pole was a round of rye flatbread. It was hard as stone. It was covered in dust. And after laboratory analysis, they confirmed it had been baked sometime around 1780, over 140 years earlier. And here is the part that gets uncomfortable. That bread still showed no signs of mold, not a single spore. Your loaf cannot survive a week. A Viking-era recipe survived a century and a half. So what did Scandinavian bakers understand about grain, heat, and moisture that the modern bread industry is hoping you never figure out? If this kind of forgotten history is your thing, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what we are about to uncover goes way deeper than bread. Let's start with what the Vikings were actually baking, because it looked nothing like what you picture when someone says the word bread. In Scandinavian farmhouses from roughly the 9th century through the 18th century, bread was not something you picked up fresh every morning. It was an event. In many parts of Sweden, Norway, and Finland, families baked bread just twice per year, once in the autumn after the rye harvest and once in the spring. They made enormous batches, dozens, sometimes hundreds of rounds at a time. And every single one had to last until the next baking day, 6 full months later. The bread they made was called knäckebröd. If you've never seen one, picture a large flat disc about the size of a dinner plate, maybe half a centimeter thick, hard as a roof tile, with a hole punched directly through the center. That hole wasn't decorative, it was engineering. Once baked, the rounds were threaded onto long birch or pine poles, and those poles were hung horizontally from the ceiling rafters in the farmhouse attic. Row after row of dry bread rounds hung in the air above the living space, where heat from the fire below rose naturally and kept the air around them warm and dry. This wasn't some quaint folk tradition. This was survival technology refined over centuries of brutal Scandinavian winters, where a failed harvest or a spoiled food supply could mean starvation before the spring thaw. Every detail of the process, the grain they chose, the thickness they rolled, the temperature they baked at, the way they stored it, was optimized for one single purpose: making bread that would not rot. And the grain at the center of all of it was rye. Now this is where the science starts to get really interesting. Rye is not just a different flavor of wheat. At a molecular level, rye flour behaves in ways that make it almost uniquely suited to long-term preservation. Wheat flour, the kind used in almost every loaf on your grocery store shelf, is dominated by proteins called gluten. When you add water to wheat flour and knead it, those gluten proteins form elastic networks. That is what gives modern bread its soft, spongy, airy texture. It is also what makes it a paradise for mold. All that air and moisture trapped inside a gluten network is exactly what fungal spores need to germinate and spread. Every air pocket in a slice of white bread is a potential mold colony waiting to happen. Rye flour works completely differently. Instead of gluten, rye is dominated by complex carbohydrates called pentosans. These molecules absorb water and lock it into a dense, gummy matrix. When you bake rye dough, the result is not soft and airy. It is tight, flat, and hard. There are no air pockets. There are no spongy cavities for spores to colonize, just a solid, dense sheet of baked grain. And that density is the first line of defense. If this is already changing how you think about the bread in your kitchen, like this video so more people discover what the Vikings figured out 1,000 years ago. But density alone does not explain why knäckebröd could survive for months hanging from an attic ceiling without a single spore of mold taking hold. For that, you need to understand a concept that food scientists call water activity. Water activity is not the same thing as moisture content. It is a measure of how much of the water inside a food is actually available for biological processes, meaning available for bacteria and mold to use. Pure water has a water activity of 1.0. Most fresh bread from a store sits around 0.95 to 0.99. And mold needs a water activity of at least 0.70 to grow at all. Most common bread molds, like Rhizopus stolonifer, the black bread mold you have probably seen on a forgotten loaf in the back of your pantry, prefer a water activity above 0.80. Now consider knäckebröd. When baked properly in a stone hearth at temperatures between 200 and 250 degrees Celsius, rolled paper thin and dried in warm, rising air, its water activity drops to somewhere around 0.30 to 0.40. That is not just below the mold threshold. That is below the threshold for virtually every form of microbial life on Earth. At a water activity of 0.35, knäckebröd is essentially as inhospitable to mold as a piece of dry wood or a fired clay pot. The Scandinavian farmwives who baked this bread did not know the phrase water activity. They had no laboratory instruments and no food science textbooks, but they understood the principle perfectly through generations of trial and observation. They knew that if you bake it thin enough, hot enough, and store it dry enough, bread simply does not rot. And rye had yet another trick that modern food science has only recently begun to appreciate. Rye grain contains a family of chemical compounds called alkyl-resorcinols. These are phenolic lipids found in the outer bran layer of the rye kernel, and they function as natural antifungal and antibacterial agents. The rye plant evolved these compounds over millennia to protect itself from fungal infection while growing in the cold, damp soils of northern Europe. Research published by the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences has shown that alkyl-resorcinols actively inhibit the growth of mold species that commonly attack stored grain and baked bread products. In simple terms, rye comes with its own built-in preservation system, and when Scandinavian bakers ground whole rye kernels into flour, bran, and all, they preserved those antifungal compounds directly in every round of bread they made. Compare that to modern white bread. Industrial milling strips away the bran and germ entirely, which is exactly where the alkyl-resorcinols live. The flour that ends up in your sandwich bread is pure, starchy endosperm, bleached, refined, and stripped of every single natural defense the grain ever had. So the modern baking industry takes a grain, removes the parts that fight mold, adds water and sugar that feed mold, creates a soft, airy texture that gives mold room to grow, seals it in plastic that traps moisture, and then acts surprised when it goes bad in 5 days. You are not buying bread. You are buying a mold incubator with a shelf placement fee. And that brings us to the question nobody in the bread aisle of your supermarket wants you to ask. Why? Why did the industry move away from rye flatbreads and dense, long-lasting loaves in the first place? The answer is not nutrition. It is not taste. It is not consumer demand. It is economics. Soft white bread became dominant in the 20th century for three reasons. It is cheaper to produce, it is faster to bake, and this is the part that matters most. It goes stale faster. A loaf that lasts 6 months is a loaf you buy twice a year. A loaf that lasts 6 days is a loaf you buy every single week. Multiply that across every household in a country, and you are looking at a staggering difference in annual revenue for the baking industry. The industrialization of bread was not about feeding people better, it was about feeding them more often. Roller mills replaced stone mills in the late 1800s because they could process wheat faster and cheaper, even though the resulting flour had been stripped of fiber, vitamins, minerals, and those critical antifungal compounds. White flour became the global standard, not because it was superior, but because it was profitable. And to make that soft, sweet, short-lived bread even more appealing to consumers who had forgotten what real bread tasted like, manufacturers started adding ingredients that would have baffled a Viking baker. High fructose corn syrup to boost sweetness, soybean oil to soften texture, dough conditioners like azodicarbonamide, a chemical compound also used in the production of yoga mats and shoe soles, calcium propionate as a synthetic mold inhibitor, because of course you need to add a chemical mold inhibitor when you have already removed all the natural ones that the grain provided for free. Pick up a loaf of store-bought white bread and read the ingredients list on the back of the package. You will count somewhere between 15 and 25 ingredients. A Viking knäckebröd had 3: rye flour, water, salt, sometimes not even the salt. The Viking baker was not primitive. The Viking baker was efficient in a way that modern industrial baking has completely abandoned. Every ingredient served a function, every step in the process had a purpose, and the end result was a food that lasted longer, required fewer resources to produce, and contained more nutrition per bite than anything sitting in the bread aisle of your local grocery store. Subscribe to this channel right now if you want to keep learning about the brilliance hiding inside ancient Viking traditions, because we are about to get practical. Let's talk about what you can actually do with this knowledge in your own kitchen. Understanding why Viking bread lasted longer is interesting, but being able to apply those principles at home is where this gets real. Step 1. Source whole rye flour. Not rye-flavored wheat flour, not light rye blend. You want dark, whole-grain rye flour that still contains the bran layer intact. This is where the pentosans live. This is where the alkyl resorcinols live. This is where the preservation magic actually comes from. If the flour is light-colored and powdery, like standard all-purpose wheat flour, it has been stripped of everything that matters. Look for stone-ground whole rye from a reputable mill. Scandinavian and German brands tend to be the most reliable because rye bread never disappeared from their food culture the way it vanished from most of the English-speaking world. Step 2. Bake thin and bake hot. The entire point of knäckebröd is maximum surface area with minimum thickness. Roll your dough as thin as you possibly can. Aim for 3 to 4 millimeters at most. Bake it at the highest temperature your home oven can reach, ideally between 220 and 250 degrees Celsius. You want the dough to dry out completely during the baking process. When it comes out of the oven, it should be rigid and crisp enough to snap cleanly in half. If it bends without breaking, it is either too thick or still holding too much moisture. The crispier and drier the finished bread, the longer it will last in storage. Step 3. stored dry and elevated. The Vikings hung their bread from the ceiling for a very specific reason. Hot air rises, and the warmest, driest air in any room is always near the top. You don't need ceiling rafters and birch poles in your modern kitchen, but you do need to keep your finished knäckebröd in a dry, well-ventilated space. A wire cooling rack inside a dry pantry works well. A traditional bread box with ventilation holes works even better. What absolutely does not work is a sealed plastic bag. Plastic traps moisture against the surface of the bread, and moisture is the single factor that separates bread lasting 6 months from bread lasting 6 days. 3 ingredients, 3 steps. And you've just replicated a preservation system that kept Scandinavian families fed through winters that would break most modern survival enthusiasts. And here is the part that puts everything into perspective. The Vikings were not the only civilization that figured this out. Cultures across the world, from the thin, lavash flatbreads of the Middle East to dried Ethiopian injera stored on woven baskets, to Finnish rieska baked on open stones, independently discovered that thin, dry, whole-grain flatbreads outlast anything made from refined flour. It is almost as if the human species spent thousands of years perfecting the art of bread preservation through trial, error, and hard-won wisdom. And then a single century of industrial food manufacturing threw all of it away for a softer chew and a faster sail. That round of knäckebröd, found hanging in a collapsed Swedish farmhouse in 1923, had been baked around 1780. It survived the Napoleonic Wars. It survived 2 world wars. It survived 143 years of dust, darkness, and neglect. And when scientists finally examined it, they found 0 mold, 0 bacterial contamination, 0 decay. Your store-bought bread started rotting 3 days ago. That Swedish farmwife's bread is still in one piece. If this changed the way you think about food, ancient craftsmanship, or what the Viking world can still teach us today, hit like and subscribe. I cover lost Viking techniques, ancestral survival wisdom, and the craftsmanship our ancestors perfected every single week. And if you want to see how the Vikings preserved meat for ocean voyages that lasted months without any form of refrigeration, that video is on its way next.